We all have those moments when we want to be very impressive. Maybe you're on a first date and finally you've met someone who is both intelligent and wildly attractive, and they also enjoy all the things that you love. Long walks on the beach, Radiohead, even sprouts. You somehow oddly find yourself talking about sprouts too eagerly. After 5 minutes of sprout-based conversation, mixing in the occasional other underloved vegetable, such as turnips and radishes, you realize it could be coming across weird. Now, you're not too sure how you got into this corner, and the only thing you can think about is sprouts, which is the one thing you don't want to be talking about or thinking about. And the minutes are ticking by, you divulge how you once sautéed sprouts and the way your grandpa used to cook them in bacon and butter to make them taste less crap, and even the time that you use sprouts to make vegetable-based art like hedgehogs. Incredibly, after 10 minutes, you haven't even mentioned the dangerous topic of sprout-based farting, which is becoming a bit of an unspoken farty elephant in the room. Eventually, you come to a fork in your sprout monologue and defiantly state that you don't normally talk this much about sprouts because you aren't weird. In fact, you also don't eat sprouts very often because, well, with that statement, you didn't quite explicitly mention the big farty elephant, but you've awkwardly alluded to it at least. And now, feeling some relief and ready to hit refresh on the conversation, you suddenly realize you need to ask the other person a question. You ask if they've ever been to Brussels. You then wish that you hadn't asked if they'd ever been to Brussels and pour yourself a pint of wine. You later regret the pint of wine as well. It is funny that often when we do need to be the most wildly impressive version of ourselves, it does seem the opposite can happen. We experience the inconvenient effect that the harder we try to be normal and easygoing, the weirder and more unnatural we become. And this isn't just with romantic relationships, it can be at work or trying to get respect in social circles. And this frustrating phenomenon isn't contained just to impressing others. In the general self-improvement realm, there is the effortlessness paradox. The harder we try to change ourselves, the more resistance we can encounter. For example, what happens if you overwater a plant? Well, it dies. Sometimes when we want to grow ourselves, often the most growth happens when we ease the pressure a little bit and stop trying to grow at all costs. In fact, doing that is like trying to plant a seed in a raging river. It's never going to work. Instead, we should allow natural change to occur over time. Well, if you are anything like me, not only are you a ninja at putting your foot in your mouth at the most inconvenient moments, you probably feel like a lot of the self-improvement narrative has got it backwards. It's certainly alluring to think of self-improvement as this linear, predictable progress, and there's a comforting warmth to think that if we just read enough books, follow enough routines, and stick to our goals, then we'll be on a fast track to the destination of the better version of ourselves. But the truth is that self-improvement doesn't work quite that way. It's messy, full of contradictions, often counterproductive, and sometimes trying to fix ourselves causes more problems than it solves. And the harder you try, the more you find yourself running into these paradoxical situations where the very effort to improve becomes the reason why you feel worse. Just like the effort to come across like a normal person can make you appear like a complete weirdo. So today, we will examine 7 of the biggest paradoxes of self-improvement and then pick up on the common threads between them to build some grand conclusions of a healthier mindset towards self-improvement that gets better results with less effort. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast, where we learn about the science of human behavior and self-improvement, and we can get a little philosophical about helping you define your own definition of a life well lived and then living it. You can call me Sam or Webster or Harris, whatever makes you happy. I'm here because I started this show because I genuinely feel like the entire genre of self-improvement gets so much of it backwards. Self-improvement is a minefield full of contradictions, time traps, and illusions of progress. And we will be asking today if striving desperately for happiness, control, and validation is actually holding us back. So stay tuned to learn how the path to self-improvement is paved with painful paradoxes. Okay, let's crack into the first paradox, which is the more you try to be happy, the less happy you can become. You may not have heard of John Stuart Mill, but he is one of the most important philosophers of the 19th century. And you can trust me on that and never think about him again for the rest of your life, if you so wish. Well, John, or Mr. Mill, if you will, spent years pursuing happiness, convinced that intellectual achievement would bring him lasting joy. But after a while of striving for achievement, he fell into a deeper and deeper depression, which was the opposite of his goal. The harder he was chasing happiness, the less of it he found. However, when he started focusing on simpler pleasures in life, like reading poetry and walking in nature, he felt a much greater sense of contentment. And he realized that happiness isn't something you can catch. In fact, trying to hold on to it is like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze it, the faster it slips out. This idea isn't just a philosophical thought experiment. It's backed by psychology too. In positive psychology, there's a concept called flow. And it's a state that you get into when you are so absorbed in an activity that time seems to disappear. Now, flow brings happiness, but it only comes when you are fully immersed in the task and not thinking about how happy you will be once it's done. There's another useful term called the hedonic treadmill, which explains why happiness is so elusive. No matter what new, shiny thing you acquire, your happiness level will return to its baseline. Let's say you get a promotion and a bigger paycheck, you'll feel great for a week or two, and then it's back to your usual malaise. We're biologically hardwired to adjust. If you ate, felt happy, and never ate again, you would die. And when it comes to happiness, when you're chasing it, it's like trying to win a race on a treadmill where you're actually unable to ever go anywhere. You're stuck in place whilst happiness keeps on moving further away in front of you. In fact, you can think of happiness a lot like that elusive potential lover from the start of the episode. When you stop chasing and trying so hard, and instead just start living in alignment with your values, embracing who you are and the inevitable ups and downs of life, that is when happiness has a way of sneaking up on you. As I said, the paradox is quite simple. The more you pursue happiness directly, the less you'll find it. Happiness tends to be a byproduct of living with purpose and not the end goal itself. Now, let's move on to the paradox of validation and how seeking validation actually lowers how valid we feel. Let's talk about Marilyn Monroe for a minute. She had everything: fame, beauty, admiration from millions of fans. Yet, despite being adored by the public, Marilyn Monroe died tragically feeling deeply unloved and empty. She spent her life searching for validation from others, and it only deepened her sense of inadequacy. We find that this paradox of validation is rooted in attachment theory, a psychological model that explains how our relationships with our parents and caregivers in early childhood shapes our attachment patterns in adulthood. If you don't have enough emotional security as a child, you can grow up needing constant external validation to feel worthy. But the issue is that the more you rely on other people's opinions to validate you, the less valid you'll feel internally. And why is this? Because every time we seek validation from other people, we're reinforcing the belief that our worth is dependent on something outside of ourselves. So it becomes a vicious, endless cycle. Our post on Instagram gets 100 likes, but instead of feeling satisfied, we're left feeling even more hollow than before and wanting to chase more likes. But the problem is that no matter how much praise or adoration we receive, it doesn't fill the void entirely, and we're like a leaky bucket, constantly trying to pour in more water to make us feel complete, but there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket that keeps draining it all away. Like Marilyn Monroe, we can get trapped in a vicious cycle of seeking external validation to fill this void within us. This relates quite closely to imposter syndrome, where even successful people feel like frauds, constantly fearing they'll be exposed as inadequate. And the irony is that the more validation and success that they get, the more doubt and pressure they have on their own abilities. So what's the solution? It's kind of simple, but not easy. and that's learning to validate yourself, cultivating a deep sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on the opinions of others. The more we can tap into our own inner well of self-love and self-acceptance, the less we feel the need to choose validation from the outside world. Now, yes, I'm aware you can go much too far on this and build a toxic level of self-loving, abundant positivity and just reject all forms of feedback because we believe we're just so brilliant and worthy as we are. We find with all paradoxes, it's about finding balance and that the right point to reach is constantly moving about, depending on the situation, depending on ourselves. And when it comes to our ego, it can feel like we're steering a boat constantly in all the wrong directions. But as long as we remember to stop focusing on external validation and cultivating a healthy amount of self-acceptance, we will be making more progress. Now let's talk about the paradox of emotions and how when we try too hard to control them, they can end up controlling us. King George VI of England had a debilitating stutter that made public speaking a nightmare. The more pressure he felt to perform, the worse his stutter became, and being a king, he obviously had quite a lot of high pressure situations for performing. Now, he tried to control his stutter by sheer will, and that only made it worse. And it wasn't until he worked with a therapist who focused on helping him accept his emotions rather than fight them that he was able to finally start speaking more fluently. Bruce Lee once said, "Be like water." And he wasn't just talking about martial arts, he was giving us the secret to emotional mastery and how to stop emotions controlling you. If you've ever tried to not think about something and ended up thinking about it even more, that's called ironic process theory. It's the reason why being told to stay calm when you're angry only makes you want to punch a hole in the wall. When we try to bottle up our emotions or push them down, they don't disappear, they linger and grow stronger and eventually explode. Imagine shaking a can of soda. The energy doesn't go away, it just builds pressure. And if you don't pop the tab and you carry on shaking it, it's eventually going to burst at an inconvenient time. We need to think of emotions like waves. If you try to fight them, they'll knock you over, and if you ride them out, they will eventually pass. Bruce Lee wasn't telling us to be passive, but to be flexible and allow the emotions to flow through us without trying to build dams against them. King George's success didn't come from suppressing his stutter, it came from accepting it and learning how to manage it in a healthy way. And we can all flow with the ebb and tide of our feelings, and we usually come to the realization that they don't have as much power over us as we imagined. When we can observe them and let them pass as they will, without reacting to them or being swept up by them, we find they don't actually last half as long as when we try to bottle them up and suppress them. Let's talk about Carl Jung and his concept of the shadow for a while. The shadow essentially refers to the parts of ourselves that we try to repress or deny. What Carl Jung found was that the more we try to push those shadow aspects of ourselves away, the more power we give to them. For example, if you try to shove a beach ball underwater, the harder you push, the more it's going to pop back up. The same is true for our inner demons and our flaws and our perceived weaknesses. The more we try to reject them, the more it creates internal conflict within us and the more we reject ourselves. Jung believed that at the heart of the change paradox, to find true self-improvement starts by integrating these darker, imperfect aspects of ourselves, embracing all the messy, contradictory parts of ourselves rather than trying to fix or eliminate them. You can think about it this way. If you want to get more organized, if you start by hating on yourself for being a stupid person who's all over the place and just a banana brain, you're not going to build faith in your organization potential. Crapping on ourselves builds a fixed mindset expectation of our incapability and weakness. If our desire to change comes from a place of rejection, we look at ourselves and we just see everything that's wrong with us, and that makes us convinced that the only way to fix ourselves is to just beat ourselves into submission. And that really doesn't work in the long run. Instead, by practicing acceptance, we can learn that true change starts once you accept things as they are rather than fighting against reality. It's the same if we get angry. Let's say, for an arbitrary example, we burnt a quiche. Now, getting angry or fighting the quiche or the oven or the recipe or ourselves doesn't fix the burnt quiche. Instead, accepting that it burned and that you had a timing fail allows for you to move forwards and make a better one. So the next time you find yourself caught in the trap of self-rejection, take a step back, ask yourself, how can I approach this with more self-acceptance? Essential to sustainable personal growth where you don't trip yourself up. Now we can move on to the planning paradox and the fact that by overplanning, we can actually lose control. Dwight Eisenhower played a pivotal role in helping lead the Allies' victory in World War II. He once said that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. What he meant was that while the act of planning is important, the actual plan almost never works out the way you expect. During the D-Day invasion, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The weather was terrible, communication broke down, troops landed in all the wrong places, but despite the chaos, Eisenhower was able to adapt their plans in real time and pivot, and still lead to one of the most decisive victories in the war. The paradox we find is that the more you try to control every detail of your life, the more you realize how little control you actually have. Humans have this thing called the illusion of control, and it's the belief that we have more influence over events than we really do. And when we overplan, we further drive this illusion that everything is under control and that we are in the driver's seat. But life rarely follows a complete script. Things do inevitably go wrong, and if you are stuck to a very rigid plan, you feel much more anxious and frustrated than if you've learned to be more flexible. This phenomenon is known as the uncertainty tolerance, and it's a really important skill for navigating the paradoxes we find in self-improvement. If we have a low tolerance for uncertainty, that makes us more likely to overplan and overthink and try to cling to this illusion of control. But when we start trying to control the uncontrollable, the more stressed and anxious we become. I'm sure you know who Steve Jobs is, and he was a meticulous perfectionist and was trying to build Apple into the world's biggest company. But it wasn't in his life plan to get fired. But the thing is, when he was fired, that led to a very creative period. He co-founded Pixar. He also built the company Next. When Apple itself started going through issues, he ultimately ended up being invited back, and he rejoined the company with more maturity and a greater sense of focus on what was truly important. And that helped him build Apple into the company it is today. At the time he was fired, it might have felt like a big step backwards. But the path to our goals are never straight, and learning to be adaptable makes it much easier to actually reach the end destinations. We find the path of self-improvement is not about rigid control, but learning to dance with the unexpected, because sometimes the most transformative moments that can happen in our lives only have a chance when we let go of the illusion of control and surrender to the mysterious unfolding of our lives. Okay, we are going to have a short break before we continue with the mysterious unfolding of this episode, so stay tuned to find out the rest of the paradoxes of self-improvement. Okay, we've had 5 paradoxes, but here is a really, really big, important one, and that is the paradox of focusing on self-improvement makes you feel inadequate. And it sounds similar to the last point, but it's really important and different. Picture this. You've attended a Tony Robbins seminar. You're reading your 7th self-help book of the month. You've got sticky notes with affirmations all over your mirror. Instead of feeling more confident and accomplished, you feel more inadequate than ever. Why? Well, this proliferation of numerous attempts at self-improvement is revealing more and more things that are wrong with you. Here you are experiencing the Dunning-Kruger effect, a phenomenon where if you know a little about something, you often overestimate your abilities, whilst the more you learn about a topic, the more you start to realize just how much you don't know. And in the realm of self-improvement, the more you dig into your flaws, the more flaws you uncover and the more areas for improvement that you have. The irony is that this builds an endless self-improvement treadmill where you constantly feel inadequate. And when you focus too much on improving yourself, you become too bogged down and focused in your flaws. The problem about this is a concept called self-discrepancy theory. It says that the more aware you are of the gap between who you are and who you want to be, the more anxious and inadequate you feel. So by reading lots of self-improvement, you are magnifying this gap between who you are and who you want to be. Every time you find another nugget of something to improve, the more focus you have on the things you lack. Now, I know we should still be improving ourselves and not falling into confirmation bias that we're brilliant or other things that our ego wants us to think. But I think one of the really big issues here is that it's so easy to read and consume information about what to do, but the process of acting on the information is just incredibly slow and it takes a lot of hard work. You can read James Clear's Atomic Habits in a single week, but to nail the art of all his suggestions, the great principles like having a habit calendar you tick off every day, neatly stacking your habits together, starting small, building them up to the point where you're hitting all your health goals, your money goals, relationship goals, doing all these great hobbies, having a morning practice, having an evening ritual, etc., etc. It's a lot that you're not going to have completed by the time that you've completed the book. In fact, doing all those things is going to take probably years of your life, and you might never even do all of them. But the issue is, after you've finished reading that book in just 1 week, you are suddenly aware of this year's worth of projects that you have to do on yourself. And instead of doing all the hard work on the things you need to do that takes years, the next thing on your list is to probably read another book and find out more ways that you are flawed. It's kind of like climbing a mountain. The higher you go, the better view you have of just how far you still have to climb. And I found this a really powerful concept for myself because it's so relevant for me to recognize how important it is to focus on slower, meaningful progress. It's so easy as a podcaster and writer to consume information about being a better podcaster and writer. There's this great piece of writing advice that says you should examine your 5 favorite authors who are all influential and have very different styles. And you should try and write 3 essays in their exact style, and you'll learn lots by doing it. And it's true. It is a brilliant piece of advice.
It is instantly actionable, but it is not instantly finishable.
Assuming you're a real person with a life, it's going to take months to get through all those essays. But that piece of advice was 1 single sentence. I could listen to 500 sentences of advice whilst listening to a podcast about writing, and that lands me with 5 years worth of writing work to do before I can eventually catch up with who I want to be. And it's insane the speed that you can find flaws with yourself compared to the speed that you can actually work on them. I don't want to give you the impression that you should just completely tune out of all advice ever. I just think people should understand that it's okay to accept the reality that growth is really slow. And ironically, we move much faster by focusing on a few realistic expectations and projects that we can work on, instead of motoring through 20 books that we can't possibly take action on. You can think of really working on self-improvement like a very slow hike across a giant continent that's thousands of miles wide. The issue is that most influencers online promise us this jet plane to our destination. By reading that one book or watching that one video, we'll somehow be radically changed, we'll be full of motivation, we'll nail our habits and our happiness. But the jet plane doesn't exist, and the mental masturbation it provides helps us avoid the real work of just putting on our hiking boots each day and ticking off a few more miles on the journey. By mentally racing ahead of ourselves, it makes us more and more aware of our flaws, and we can create more of this internal self-rejection that is totally unhelpful, whilst also avoiding the important part of doing anything useful.
The other issue is that so much content is quite binary. It's either in the believer, achiever, so much self-love, you are a wondrous ball of ecstatic brilliance and you don't need to change anything about yourself. You just need to believe in yourself and then all things will come true. Or it's kind of endless advice of optimizing yourself, doing harder work, pushing yourself, or believing that all of your problems come from the fact that you're not good enough yet. Elements of both are true, but going in either direction is incorrect. They don't help you build the right amount of the right thing at the right time. When it comes to reading to make yourself a deeper thinker with much greater wisdom and awareness, I'd really focus much more on reading psychology, science, philosophy, history, biographies, books about the arts, general interest things, and then of course fiction. It really helps take you into the world of other people and builds empathy. And if a piece of fiction is really good, the characters will be psychologically complete and it takes you into their heads without so many endless lists about all the things you need to improve on yourself. That doesn't mean completely stop reading or engaging in any self-improvement, just means don't engage overly in it and be more deliberate about focusing on one area for a while until you feel more comfortable on it before slogging through endless more self-improvement.
Remember, the goal isn't about perfection, it's about progress. When we reflect back on the lessons that we've been learning through this episode, I think a through line springs out. The more we strive to control the world around us and have an iron fist on our outcomes, the more brittle and breakable we are. Whether it's our plans imploding in our face, or our emotions overflowing in the wrong places, or just exhausting ourselves chasing faster and faster after a goal that gets further and further away. Ultimately, life is really long. We only need to be improving ourselves a tiny amount each day to make huge amounts of progress. We don't need a 20-year-long list of self-improvements before we can eventually be happy with ourselves. We can be happy today if we allow it. My sister has a really cute little cat called Miso, and she is a really timid cat. If new people are visiting my sister's house, the cat lovers will try to make friends with Miso, and they'll approach her, they'll be trying to pick her up and rub her, but they just scare her away. And after Miso's run away, maybe a few hours later, they'll try to pick her up again. And this can go on for days. Ultimately, Miso becomes so terrified that she just won't even come out her room. Yet, if you don't invade Miso's personal space, if she's asking to go outside, maybe you open the door for her, but you don't try to pick her up, after a day or two of just letting Miso be Miso, she'll start to be used to your presence. And one evening when you're watching TV, she might even come and sit on your lap when you don't expect it. This approach for letting Miso come to you isn't about giving up on befriending her, but it's about being less grabby and less demanding of instant results and accepting that reality isn't always on the timescale that we want it. But patience can bring results much faster than chasing them. And happiness can be a little bit like a timid cat. It will lovingly creep up on you when you stop grasping for it. And that is your lesson. If you have a friend who won't stop talking about sprouts, cats, or King George VI, well, you could send them this episode because that is how the show grows. You can also book a call with me for free by using the link in the description, or join our premium community to access ad-free episodes and chat in the Discord community about any weird stuff that your mind does. Remember, you are in charge of your own life, so stop chasing after cats and talking about sprouts, and smile more at strangers. Do enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.